Hello, everyone. This is Noreen at the Healthy Peaceful Podcast. This afternoon, I had the fabulous opportunity to chat with Melanie Sachs. Melanie has spent many decades expanding the healing energy of Ayurveda throughout the world. She is the co-author of 2 books along with her husband, Robert, Ayurvedic Beauty Care and Ayurvedic Spa, treatments for large and small spas. Melanie's exploration into alternative healing include years of study with Michio Kushi, one of the forces behind bringing organic foods and macrobiotics to the US. She started her Ayurvedic studies with the renowned teacher, Dr. Vasant Lad, whose life work is profiled in the documentary, A Doctor from India. During the course of her career, Melanie has worked directly with the spa industry to develop ancient Ayurvedic techniques into successful spa services, matching the ancient wisdom of Ayurveda with the modern demand for beauty and relaxation. Today, we are going to shift to Melanie's interest in permaculture and growing soil and food for maximum diversity and sustainability. She will introduce us to the concept of the friendly forest and how it relates to the principles of permaculture and Ayurveda, and can serve as a model for helping us shift toward a more peaceful, just, joyful, sustainable, and supportive world. Welcome, Melanie, to the Healthy Peaceful Podcast.
Thanks so much. That was a fantastic introduction. And like a lot of moment, it's kind of taking me aback when somebody says, 4 decades. It's totally true. You know,
it's funny how that happens, right?
It's funny how that happens when, you know, I'm watching a show that's about time travel right now, and they go all the way back to 1986. Oh my gosh, all the way back.
Oh, isn't that funny? Isn't that funny? Yeah, all the way back.
Yeah, which actually coincidentally is when I first started studying with Dr. Lad. Right.
Wow. So. yeah. It's and it definitely is a different world now. There's no doubt, but it doesn't mean that the same problems didn't exist then as now. So let's jump right in. One thing that I looked at was just, well, first of all, I'd like to hear about your current interest and how I assume you had an interest right along, being someone who's been involved with Ayurveda since the mid-'80s with food. But what is the shift? And then you were very much involved with the beauty industry. And so the shift now is looking at permaculture and the principles of permaculture, and really how they can really, we can step it up in terms of just our overall health and to me, that's where the connectivity to Ayurveda is. I was looking at the 12 principles of permaculture. We can look at those and think about permaculture and Ayurveda, or you can just jump right in and start talking about how this has come to you and what you see for the future.
I would honestly rather you didn't hold me to the 12 principles.
Sure, that's fine. Let's roll.
I'm a total baby beginner in the formal study of permaculture.
Yeah,
you're right. I've always been interested in food. I mean, that's something. Well, that's not true. As a kid, I was an appallingly terrible eater. Very fascinating. The things that I loved to eat were rice and vegetables. But you know, nobody was eating rice and vegetables in 1960.
Right. Yeah, I understand. It was more like
the picky kid that would only eat breakfast cereal, the picky kid that really didn't want meat on their plate. You know, I was a bit anomalous. So I was considered a bad eater, right? A poor eater, because I didn't go for standard, as you can hear from my voice, English fare. So, and my interest personally began, and this was a reflection after decades, right? That, oh, how fascinating that it was actually the spa and skincare business that beckoned to me after my Ayurvedic training, because one of the reasons that I got involved with anything in terms of, I would say, complementary healing in the beginning was that I had terrible, terrible eczema as a child. I had weeping, oozing eczema head to toe as a baby, and could only wear silk clothes because everything else irritated. To this day, I can't wear wool. And so,
which could be problematic when you live in England.
yeah, that's a good point. Which meant wool was everywhere, right?
Right.
Or certainly in the winter. But it was that quest that I think you and I share for, how can I make my world work? How can I make my personal health better? There must be answers out there.
Right.
I met Michio Kushi in, oh my gosh, this is okay. I don't care about aging me, right? We're doing this a long time, right?
We're sages anyway, right?
That's it. 1976. That's when I met Kushi, right?
Wow.
That
was like the heyday. That was the heyday.
It was it was actually almost pre-heyday. It might have been heyday in America, but in England,
okay.
Can you imagine it? Just thinking of the whole food industry now, right? In England, there was one place in the whole of the city of London where you could buy brown rice, and they had brown rice on the floor that you shoveled into your own bag. That was it, right? That was
like a precursor to bulk bins or something.
Bulk bins, yeah, goodness. And that was how you got any whole grain, right? That was it. That was what you did. It was very low tech,
right?
And I think we have to remember now very strongly that it was the impetus behind it was kind of revolutionary, in that we really wanted to bring very healthy food to everybody. Everybody. My son-in-law presently bags on my daughter, saying, oh, this way of eating is so exclusive and so expensive. And it's like, it's very readily available, and you're right, it costs more, and it costs even excessively. I mean, in the time that we've lived in California, we've seen farmers markets transition from a very affordable way to buy veggies to something that I would now consider artisan produce, right? That comes at a premium. So, going back to me, it was actually macrobiotics that helped me heal my eczema, thanks to Michio. And I was always then continually fascinated by the connection between health and food, because my initial training in health was as an occupational therapist in Britain. And I realized at one point, I remember the day that I was sitting in a lecture and I was listening to this guy who was, I think he was a heart surgeon. And I asked him the question, why do some people get heart attacks and other people don't?
That's a good question.
And he said, we don't know. And at that point, I
felt, at least he was honest.
He was honest. And at that point, I felt honestly like standing up and leaving the room. I don't want to, I'm not particularly interested in your, the mechanics of your surgical procedures as a remedy.
Right.
What really fascinates me is, how could we heal that without the surgery? And two, why, if you can't tell me why people are getting sick, how can you possibly tell me that you know anything about a cure? And that seems logical to me, right? If you
well, it seems like your approach is a very simple approach. If you can't identify the cause, then how can you adequately identify the remedy absent surgery?
Correct.
You know,
You know,
so
I will be first to say surgery has its place. Remember, Ayurveda says, you know, the goal is to preserve life, and sometimes it takes surgery. I'm not
sure.
absolutely, don't run away with the idea that I'm
No, not at all, not at all. But I think you make the point more about these chronic lifestyle diseases that are, preventable, or, we're not necessarily stuck with our genes. There's epigenetics, and we can have a direct impact on the progression or no progression of disease by how we handle our mind, how we feed ourselves the prana through food and air and clean water. So, it's and those concepts are mainstream. It doesn't mean everyone's necessarily eating brown rice, but to some extent, those concepts are mainstream. But it's kind of like modern medicine hasn't caught up yet. There's a little bit of that. It doesn't mean that there hasn't been exponential progress, but there's still an archaic system that we contend with. There's no doubt.
And it's always exciting to me. I absolutely don't want to bag on Western approaches.
Mm-hmm.
I just get excited when I hear something that's really positive in that direction. And this week, I heard that somewhere in California, they are delivering healthy meals to diabetic patients.
Right? That's wonderful. That's fantastic.
And health meals on prescription, which, you and I know that when somebody isn't well, the idea of taking on a whole new regimen, leave alone a whole new eating can be completely overwhelming. And you need to get at least a little bit better to have the bandwidth before you can even take on, I could go to the store and maybe I could fix this myself, right? So this idea of delivering meals, phenomenal, fantastic. I mean, there was this woman saying, I'm just beginning to get the idea that I could like Brussels sprouts.
Yeah, no, I love that. And there's been, I'm from New Haven, Connecticut, and there's been a lot of that in terms of, I live in Fairfield, Iowa, but I'm from New Haven. So there's a lot of progressive activity very similar to that, like prescriptions for food prescriptions, food and farming, which is awesome, it really is. So you started very early making the connection between food and health and delved into macrobiotics. And how did Ayurveda come on your, it's kind of interesting because I did the same thing. I studied Ayurveda, then went and studied macrobiotics at the Kushi Institute, then came back to Ayurveda. So tell me about how Ayurveda came on your radar and why you found Ayurveda to be significant and important, and how it changed your trajectory.
Well, I would say, back in 76, my husband and I were interested in any kind of complementary medicine. And one of the systems that we came across through our spiritual community, because we were involved with Tibetan Buddhism in 1976.
I've seen the books, yeah.
And so, Tibetan medicine is basically Ayurveda. It's a beautiful blend of Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine, but very strongly its principles are Ayurvedic. So I had some notion from the beginning, some notions about it, but it was more theoretical. It wasn't particularly practical. It wasn't really dietarily orientated at that time. And it wasn't until a number of years later where, my karma was such that some difficult things happened in my life. My third child died of crib death, and I became really ill after that. And
sorry about that.
Now it's a long time ago. It actually was 39 years ago yesterday. So we're extra remembering her at the moment.
Absolutely.
But an opportunity to look for something deeper. There we were mainstays of the holistic healing community in Lexington, Kentucky. And there were plenty of people at that time, remember this was 80s, that basically said, you bought this on yourself. I actually had a macrobiotic teacher say to me, your baby died because I saw you eating butter one morning.
Oh my goodness.
Right?
I'm sorry, I don't mean to laugh, but that is so ridiculous.
I'm not making it up. I am absolutely not making it up. And so it was like, oh, well, I think I need something a little kinder than this.
Yeah, you weren't, it wasn't feeling like, you didn't need a rigid approach, especially after a personal loss like that.
Right, a blame and shame game.
Right.
Where, you're the idiot that's ignorant that's brought this on yourself.
Yeah, the blame is useless in those situations. So.
And there was a lot of it at the time. It was the dark side of, we can have a positive impact by positive action. The dark side of it was, these people are idiots. They don't know how to make positive actions, and they're just bringing hell on themselves.
Yeah.
So,
you make a great point, because it's kind of the yin and the yang, the dark, the light and the dark, and they're all, no matter what movement or modality you're involved in, if taken to an extreme, it can definitely have a shadow aspect. So that's a very good point.
Right. Yeah.
It's important to come back to a place of middle ground, and a place that feels practical and sensible in your own life. So
and to know when something is no longer completely right for you.
Absolutely. That's another thing too, is we're going to what's feeling like it's really completing at the moment may not be where you're going to be 5 years from now. So
right.
Yeah.
And I met Dr. Lad in 1984. And I met him at the Omega Institute. And when people ask me, why did you get involved with Ayurveda? I simply say, I met Dr. Lad, and his kindness was overwhelming.
Yeah, it's a gift to be in his presence, there's no doubt.
And it was and I've encountered that with many Ayurvedic doctors. At one point, I couldn't honestly tell you which doc it was. He took my pulse and he said, "Oh, Melanie, you have blah 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 blah." And I said, does that mean I have a problem, doctor? And his response was, "We have a problem."
Oh, I love that. I love that. Yeah.
Well, let's say we have something we can work on together.
Sure.
Right? And it's just that feeling of, it's not other, that it's a journey together that is really engaging. And, that's what I really hope I carried into the spa business, where, when it comes to beauty, there's a huge amount of cultural judgment. So,
there's been a lot of backlash to the beauty industry, no doubt. So, but I just want to back up a little bit about your point about, Maharishi Ayurveda, which is what I'm involved with right now. It's very much an emphasis on, energetically what the healer is bringing. And even in the pulse, if you're grounded, settled in consciousness, just grounded in consciousness, then there's healing that occurs in merely taking the pulse. I love that point, that it's not, it's kind of a unified approach between healer and person seeking healing. So thank you for that. Yeah. So the beauty industry, you spent many years in the beauty industry. Why was that important to you? And how did you gravitate to that particular industry?
Well, it's because I am not a person that makes a 5-year plan.
Beautiful.
By which I mean every opportunity that I've ever had professionally has spontaneously arisen, and I most often said yes, right?
Yes.
So
That's beautiful. Well, it's sort of like the Deepak Chopra approach, the spontaneous fulfillment of desire.
so did I have I had a desire to be useful. That was the overarching desire. I want to be, this has benefited me personally. I want to do something useful. And the very first piece of work that I was offered right after Ayurvedic school, so this was 87, 88, was in Finland. And it was at a beautiful spa in Helsinki. And I just, looking back on it, they didn't even ask me to talk about beauty and Ayurveda, but I just thought to myself, my gosh, these people are willing to pay my ticket from Lexington, Kentucky, and on a recommendation of a macrobiotic teacher friend of mine, trust me to teach a group of people for a week. I better bring them something that's relevant to their business.
That's great. Yeah, you were thinking about the setting, where you were, and what would be useful for them. That's perfect.
Exactly. And so, we had a group of 20 women from 6 different countries. Most of them spoke some kind of Scandinavish or English, so there were, and anyway, it was a little bit of a birth by fire, but I realized that that's sort of what I did, right?
Yeah.
So you
were comfortable in that role.
I took I took mama point therapy. I took netrabasti. I took that's ghee on the eyes for people that aren't so familiar with Ayurvedic treatment. Nasya, putting, things that I'd seen as part of Panchakarma that I'd also seen had a really positive effect on the face. And I can honestly say, after a week, these women looked phenomenal.
Okay.
And my hostess was the secretary of Sedesco. That's the highest kind of accreditation you can get in beauty therapy in Europe.
I see. Okay.
And so, she was not a newcomer. She had been in the business a very long time, had quite an elevated position in the organization. And she was just wildly impressed and said, Melanie, you should write about this. And I came home, and my neighbor had been to South Africa and come back from South Africa because she felt she could no longer live there. And she said, oh, Melanie, what's new? And I said, well, I'm thinking about writing a book about Ayurveda and beauty. And she said, that's fantastic. I'm wanting to do more with computers and do desktop publishing. I need a project that has text and photo.
Okay. That's great. So you found your first collaborator.
So my first little book was from Kinko's, right, which was the copy shop at the time.
Right. So, yes, I remember Kinko's. Yep.
She desktop published my first little book. And that was the little book that I eventually submitted to Lotus Press. And I got a call back saying, how quickly can you write 10 times as much?
Okay.
So I never sought a publisher either, right?
Okay.
And I did. I sent in a proposal, but I only had one publisher, which was Dr. Lad's publisher.
Right.
That was the beginning.
That's wonderful.
Ayurvedic beauty care book. So
yeah, awesome. And so did that book open doors for you?
Yeah, it did. Anybody that's interested in publishing knows that books, unless you have a smash bestseller, They don't earn you much, but they
Right.
really give you credibility.
Right.
And it,
So
it
they elevate your profile.
exactly elevated my profile. And it was on the strength of that that I got to work with the International Dermal Institute, and they started sending me to their centers in England and Australia and all over this country. And so I taught myself to teach Ayurveda to estheticians, skincare therapists.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, that's wow. Wow. So I'm assuming that over this period of time, you continued your interest in food.
Yeah, I kept eating.
Yes. Yeah.
I kept learning.
And it's always very evident when you look at someone, you have a sense for how they eat. You know, at least I do. Whether they're eating well, whether they're eating more of a natural diet and unprocessed and high prana foods. So moving and shifting to where you are today and the interest that you're cultivating in permaculture, and specifically you call it the friendly forest.
Okay, so
first of all, how does that relate to your prior work? There's got to be a connection there or a door that opened.
Okay, so I would say I had an interest in permaculture maybe 10 years ago. And I thought of permaculture at that time as an instrument for getting closer to people in my community that had similar interests.
Okay.
Also, a way of getting closer to my environment. I am not one of these people that came to the United States and said immediately, oh, I've found my home place on the planet.
Right. So you wanted to become intimate with your community and intimate with your environment, essentially.
I mean, literally my surroundings, literally the earth under my feet.
Sure. So when you say you came to the US and you didn't immediately feel like you found a home,
no.
Have you ever had that feeling in the US anywhere?
Maybe New Mexico the most.
Okay. Yeah, New Mexico, it definitely has it is the land of enchantment, and it has that energy.
Some people call it the land of enchantment. Some people call it the land of entrapment. But
I haven't heard that, but I haven't been there in the summertime, so I don't know. Maybe I would call it that too.
I think
is that entrapment in a good way or a bad way?
When we first started with Dr. Lad, a lot of people had a lot of trouble settling into Albuquerque.
Yeah.
It is not an easy environment at all to settle into. But it was sufficiently foreign to me that I always knew I was living in a foreign place, right? It's a kind of environment that forces you to pay attention to the environment. When it's 105, you can't, nobody in their right mind says, oh, I'm going to take my baby in a stroller and take a 5 mile.
Right. You have to be very alert as to what's happening. There's no doubt. Is there a dust storm? All of that stuff.
Yeah, it forces that. So, it was nothing like where I was raised. And I think that helped. Okay. California, also really nothing like where I was raised. Right. But I knew there was no more going home, so I better settle in.
Okay.
And I would say, so that was the impetus. And then, then it kind of took a back burner. I didn't own a property. I didn't have a place to garden. Joggity jog, moved around, did a lot of travel. And then, as I put permaculture on the back burner, permaculture developed and became more of a system, and there were more and more teachers. I think, Bill Mollison was practically the only teacher when I was studying permaculture. rather like, knowing Michio Kushi back in the day,
Right, or Dr. Lad at the
or
time that
Dr. Lad, right, in the
he wanted
80s.
to study Ayurveda. He probably was the only one,
Practically, yes.
Yes, I
Um,
understand.
so, fast forward,
Mhm.
I I got older.
Mhm.
The pandemic happened. We
Sure.
were no longer traveling and teaching. We were barely seeing clients. And I owned a property. And it happens to be near the ocean with very, very sandy soil. And so the question became, what is the guy 2 blocks down the road doing who has a very productive 28-acre organic farm? Could I do that on my property? And why is soil so important? Because,
Mhm.
in Britain, my grandpa was a gardener, my father was a gardener. People garden, people used to, I don't know about now, garden a lot in Britain. You never really had to think about soil. It's sort of baseline was pretty much okay. When,
Right.
when you're starting with a sand dune,
Sure. It's
the
very
baseline
different.
is zip almost.
Yes.
So it really makes you think about what are plants actually doing, what is in the soil, what is in the soil that isn't earth, actually isn't dust, that makes
Mhm.
plants grow.
Mhm.
And right at that time there was a lot of information coming forward about the microbiome, right?
Yes.
So the microbiome is all about the microbes that make up our body, and even down to the tiniest cellular level.
Mhm.
And the first book I read about microbes was about microbes in the soil. And I immediately said, oh, this is really one of the invisible forces in the world, that
Oh
this
yeah.
that
Yeah.
this explains so much, even to the point where I was hearing that there were, what are they called? Microbes that live in extreme climates, like they live in literally molten lava. There are
Mhm.
microbes that live in the stratosphere. So it was another way of saying the whole world is alive. And what
Sure.
they're alive with, one of the elements that they're alive with is microorganisms, things that we can't see, but
Mhm. But are critical to our health and the planet's health.
exactly
And,
critical.
and, and I've heard with the microbiome that I've heard it said that modern science has caught up with Ayurveda, or it's a real validation of Ayurveda in terms of, everything starting in the gut.
Exactly.
Uh,
Exactly.
and so now we have this modern concept of the microbiome. So it's a real boon for Ayurveda and the ancient wisdom that knew this right along.
Exactly. I mean, good digestion always made sense. Nobody feels well if they're constipated or have the runs, but actually understanding how you improve gut health, and this
Yeah.
business of not destroying your microbiome and actually
Mhm.
supporting your microbiome, it completely makes, I mean, you're right, it's a real obvious link and validation. So you can't keep good gut health if you're eating foods that are poisonous to your microbiome, or foods that are going to be disrupting your microflora in your gut.
Mhm. Yeah,
You
no,
can't grow
absolutely.
food if you can't grow food in the same way. Pouring chemicals on the land and making the land basically destitute, bar the chemicals that we think it needs, doesn't help, doesn't make for healthy plants at all.
Yeah, absolutely. So, given your some of the things that are important to you, moving closer to community and creating community, and really moving closer and having a more intimate understanding of your environment, um, move into this concept of the friendly forest and how you conceived of that, why you think it's important. Um, maybe there's a book about that. So tell me a little bit about
Maybe there's
you,
a little article about that. I don't know.
well, it can start with an article or an ebook or something, right?
Right, right.
Yeah, yeah.
So, this idea came along because a lovely friend of mine who I hadn't seen in years and years came to visit. And she's the kind of friend that, you're kind of on parallel paths, and you know that you've had similar interests for a long time. So it was kind of like, oh, what have you been doing for the last 10 years?
Right. You can easily catch up. Yeah.
Right. And so this is somebody who had studied Ayurveda a little later than me. This is somebody who had been to India and had a beautiful healing women's retreat center there. She kind of, I can't say, I think she'd gone deeper and I'd
Okay.
kind of gone wider, let's say.
I see. Okay, that's a good way to describe it.
And she had similar experience during the pandemic. And of course, because she's more of a studier than me, she took a permaculture course. So this started the obvious conversation, what is she said, I studied permaculture, Melanie, because it's a system like Ayurveda is a system. It's
Okay.
another way of understanding what's in front of us. And
That's a beautiful way to put it. So there's parallels.
deep,
She was drawing parallels between permaculture and Ayurveda.
right. What one of the principles is, before you do anything, you observe, right?
Yeah, actually that is the first principle: observe and then interact.
Exactly. Okay. So it's presented in permaculture, where you look at an entire landscape or you look at an entire property. It's there in Ayurveda where you look at the whole client and everything in their personal environment, which is sort of their personal landscape, if you will.
Sure.
And so, we were talking about analogies, and I said to her something like, well, do you know the book, The Giving Tree?
I've heard of it. But yeah, but I haven't read it.
The life of a tree, right?
Okay.
And I just said, well, I think there's a great analogy here between, a healthy forest and a healthy community, that because of our personal prejudices, it's very easy to say, oh, this person's useful and that person isn't useful.
Yes.
That person isn't beautiful. But you don't walk into a forest and say, oh, I mean, it's unusual if you would say, I hate that tree, or that's a useless piece of grass, right?
Right.
It's given because it has, if it's a healthy forest, it has its harmony. And
Right.
everything, if you know anything about a forest, everything has its place.
Sure. Everyone is a valuable contributor in everything.
Absolutely. So
And
if it's easy to see that in a forest, or easier for people to see that in a forest, that's a great beginning for shifting a view for how we actually look at the people around us.
yeah. Well, it certainly is an approach that it could take us beyond divisiveness, which is essentially where we are.
A big issue of the time.
Yeah.
Whatever ism that you come up with, whether it's color or gender or age or nationality, it's not there in a healthy forest.
Right. Yeah, that's beautiful. That's a beautiful approach, and to look at the parallels, and to look at what are the principles in a healthy forest that can be useful to creating one peaceful world, essentially.
Yeah, very much.
So,
in terms of brain science, they now know, I mean, this, to anybody that likes to go into nature, those people know that walking on a beach or walking in a forest or next to a river is stress reducing. Now it's proven, right? Now they actually know the brain chemistry, that it actually shifts your brain chemistry to do that in a positive way. In the same way, fascinatingly, that digging a hole, not even for any reason, just digging a hole in the ground switches on the same brain chemistry.
Yeah, just being close to the earth, you know.
Something about it, something primordial there.
Right. Well, it's also probably there's probably, like, you know, the hugging the tree, there's probably something electromagnetic as well.
Could be.
And you know, they say the grounding with, you know, being in the bare feet on the soil.
Yeah.
That it's rebalancing our electrical charge and more fully aligning us.
Right.
And realigning our prana as well. So
deeply connecting. And again, you know, I've been fortunate to live in places where you could easily get to countryside. Just realizing how disconnecting city life is, that, you know, I tend to think of these things like digging a carrot out of the ground is a common experience. It totally isn't.
No, it's not.
Most children can't name you 3 vegetables, and most of them don't eat more than 3 or 4.
Yeah, no, that is so so true, so true. I'm just looking at scanning the principles of permaculture and see if there's parallels to Ayurveda. Well, one would be integrate rather than segregate. And it talks about, think about your garden as a much wider network of community gardens. Rather than trying to achieve self-sufficiency, think about building connections between households, aim for community sufficiency. So how do you think that relates to perhaps a principle in Ayurveda, which is all about our connection to nature and nature's rhythms?
You know, I think one of the things that isn't so obvious to people is that when Ayurveda was written, people did live in community and they were deeply earth connected, because there wasn't another way to live at the time.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, let's say the vast majority. And if they lived in a city, more than likely they had relatives that were earth connected. And so this piece about being earth connected and in community is something I think that really needs to be reintroduced. And in a lot of ways, I think macrobiotics did that well, right? Macrobiotics was, in the beginning anyway, very much about people getting together and eating good food. And I don't see that much of a movement, maybe where you are in Fairfield, but you know, I don't see that as kind of like the groundswell of the Ayurvedic movement. I feel like the groundswell of the Ayurvedic movement is more like, you know, go to a doc, get pulses taken.
Yeah, you know, that's a great point. I love that. I love that. Maybe there could be a new groundswell of the Ayurvedic movement, that there could be communities that are connected through Ayurvedic principles.
Exactly.
Just like the principles of permaculture, and it would allow for more exponential growth of the principles of Ayurveda, so that Ayurveda could really become mainstream and not just something that's on the fringe. Even though people say, "Oh, it is mainstream," it's not really. You know, it hasn't had the growth of yoga and the acceptance and understanding. You know, so.
And you know, I think you know, Michio Kushi introduced brown rice.
Right.
I've known many doctors, and I remember this lecture so well, when the woman stood on the stage and said, So, when you're cooking your first pot of rice in the morning, and I looked at my husband and I said under my breath, how many people in this audience get up and cook a pot of rice? Not the majority, right? So
That's true. That's true. Yeah.
India still has a rich food culture, and many people still do cook. It's changing radically and very, very fast.
Yeah.
The culture that Ayurveda has come from has that, and it would be a real shame to lose that. But it's not that everybody's going to start eating curry.
Yeah.
The idea that everybody has to the ideal isn't to eat Japanese style in terms of macrobiotics.
Right. I mean, there's going to be that element. There's going to be that element in Ayurveda because of where it comes from, and that element in macrobiotics because of where it comes from.
So in the very beginning, we started calling it macrovedic, like the really big thing, right?
Right. That's wonderful. I like that. That could be like the friendly forest, macrovedic.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, I think that if there's an opportunity to have a more community-based approach with Ayurveda in the U.S., that there might be more possibilities for Ayurveda to really start to proliferate in a meaningful way.
One of the more exciting things that I did, I think, was I did a cooking class at the NAMA conference, National Ayurvedic, whatever it's called.
Right.
And NAMA, it's wonderful that it's there to help Ayurveda become more established.
Mm-hmm.
But it has paid very little attention, in my view, to what I call basic lifestyle and eating, exercise, and body care. And I feel without those things, everything else is just the cream on the cake.
Oh, absolutely. Those are the key things. Those are the key elements to it's like laying the foundation for good health. There's no doubt.
Right. So
I mean, herbs are all great, and but if you don't have those critical components in place, they're just not going to be effective,
right,
or as effective.
So I also was radical enough to say, Ayurveda was never designed to be a vegetarian regime, and so I'm going to make buffalo burgers Ayurvedic style.
I'm sure
popular.
They were popular
and controversial.
I'm sure they were very delicious as well.
And what came up was things that were real issues. Women came and said, I'm happy to be vegetarian, but my husband isn't. We're finding that we can't sit at the same table and eat the same meal. And it's like, man, if a family can't sit at the same table and eat the same meal, this has to be remedied. This is not.
Yeah, I think that it's like going back to that story that you shared about the macrobiotic community and about their reaction to your personal loss and blaming it on food or diet. I think if Ayurveda is saying that if there's a rigidity and not really being practical or really being modern as well, that we're not trying to recreate something that was 5,000 years ago. There's modern Ayurveda, and how is it applicable to my modern life? I mean, that's really, and how is it helpful and useful?
Well, and isn't that how it's lasted all of these years? I always say Ayurveda isn't a list of you should and you should not. It's like permaculture in that it stands on basic principles, and the idea is to understand and apply. And I understood enough and applied to the beauty industry, and maybe now I will understand and try and apply this to the friendly forest. I
love that, because you're undertaking a journey, and it sounds like your approach has been even in the beauty industry. Well, here I am this is what's in front of me, and I'm going to understand and apply. You know,
Right.
it's the permaculture principle of, you know, observe and interact. So
Tell me what you need. Tell
right,
me what you don't understand. Tell me where the gaps are. Right. Or show me, actually, not tell me.
yes, and experimentation, and observing again, and experimenting and observing again, and you know, moving toward a greater synergy as you continue to observe and interact with the environment. So,
Right.
okay. Okay. Well, this was wonderful, Melanie. Is there anything else that you'd like to share before we call it a wrap?
I would just like to say, Noreen, I think this is another, oh my gosh, I was wondering what next. And then your call came out of the blue, and I said to you, friendly forest, like, oh my gosh, that just jumped right out of the box, right?
Wonderful. I
So,
love that. Love that.
maybe now, I'll feel like my feet are a little bit held to the fire to think about this more and to do a little bit more. I don't know. I don't know if that's it. I would like to end with this really interesting story. What's interesting.
Sure.
Okay. So I decided that I was going to make my garden in my front yard. This was during the pandemic because
That's great. That's because that's always controversial to the neighbors.
not only, I live in a place where it wouldn't be so controversial.
Okay, good, good.
I mean, I don't think anybody would complain. I don't live in a suburb in
Okay.
that way, but it did mean that we painted the eaves of our house bright yellow to cheer people up.
Oh, that's great. That's
So
great.
our house became like, oh my God, what are they doing there, right? And it meant that I got to talk to people.
That's awesome because when you're gardening, you're outside, you're not hidden in your backyard.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So one day I just see this. I don't like litter. I'm a triple Virgo. So there was this card, just piece of card, the size of a playing card, right by my front gate. And of course I had to pick it up. I pick it up, and it's a tarot card. And it's a tarot card of the high priestess.
Oh,
And I look around and I think, well, did somebody drop that out of a backpack? Are there others floating around? No, just it, face down, right at my front gate.
oh my goodness.
So this morning, when I was thinking about what we were going to be talking about, I just did a quick Google, like, what does that mean? Because, there I was in the garden, just kind of thinking about, gardening, but thinking about what's next. And, was gardening enough? Was gardening the thing I needed to be doing?
Mhm.
And it came up with 4 ideas: that the high priestess is about mystery, is about stillness, is about passivity, and it's about retreat.
That's
So
beautiful.
I feel honestly like a lot of people during the pandemic, it's been a time of getting in touch with deep mystery, being really still, being pretty passive. We weren't the people that said, oh, how are we going to do our business now? We just decided to take care of the property, stay home, be in retreat, and hold that stillness for what's next to be revealed. And
Mm,
maybe this program is part of it, Noreen, because my friend Nika came after really 10 years we hadn't seen one another, and we were like 2 peas in a pod. And very soon after she left is when you called.
that's beautiful. That's
And her one question to me was, oh, you're going to say yes to that? How is that going to further your vision? I don't know. I don't know.
Well, if you don't say yes, you'll never know.
And if you don't say yes, you'll never know, which is exactly how I've always operated.
Beautiful. Well, thank you for sharing that. That's really beautiful. And it's something for you to continue to ponder.
for sure.
Yeah. And but you know, the name of my podcast, the Healthy Peaceful Podcast, is based on Michio Kushi's book, One Peaceful World.
Oh, lovely.
So yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Well, this can
connection.
so if viewers, listeners would like to get in touch with you, is there a good way to do that or to reach out?
You know,
Is that something you're amenable to, or
we do have a website. It's
okay.
diamond, like the jewel, way,
Mhm.
W-A-Y, Ayurveda.com. That's probably the simplest way of
Okay,
getting.
great.
Want
Thank you.
me directly, then Melanie Sachs at gmail.com.
Sachs is SACHS at
Right.
Gmail.
And
Okay,
there's
great.
a little initial A there.
Right, awesome.
I
So
rue the day that I put it there, but I did it anyway. Melanie
okay, that's great.
at Gmail.
Thanks so much, Melanie. This has really been a pleasure, and we'll be in touch.